Hello, everyone, and thank you for coming to today's webinar, Creating Impactful Infographics. My name is Alex Burdett, and I'm happy to be here on behalf of the Agricultural Genomics Action Center, or AGACT, which is hosting today's session. AGACT is a knowledge mobilization hub funded by Genome Canada as part of the Climate Smart Agriculture and Food Systems Initiative. Our role is to connect interest holders across the genomics ecosystem to amplify the impact of genomics research. And we do this by supporting knowledge mobilization activities, offering training opportunities for both students and researchers, and by working to ensure that research informs both policy and practice. Today's session is part of that mission. We're helping researchers and professionals communicate their work in clear, creative, and compelling ways. Over the next 90 minutes, we'll explore how to create infographics that are not only eye-catching, but also tell a clear story. We're very pleased to have Alex Sawatzky leading this training. Alex is a creative advisor at the Arrell Food Institute at the University of Guelph, where she specializes in science communication and visual storytelling. So with that, I will hand things over to Alex to guide us through today's webinar.
Hi, Alex. Thank you. I'm also Alex, and I'm delighted to be here today. I am just going to share my screen so we can get started. Here we go. All right. Hi, everyone. Again, I'm Alex. I use she and they pronouns. As Alex said, I'm the creative advisor at the Arrell Food Institute. I work at the intersection of research, art, design, and knowledge mobilization. Essentially, like where all those things intersect is usually where you'll find me. I have a PhD in public health from the University of Guelph. That research involved working in partnership with an Inuit community in Nunatsiavut, Labrador. And that's where I really developed skills and a passion for relational approaches to research, specifically community-led research and knowledge sharing. And through this experience, I created a lot of visuals to reflect ideas and themes as they developed throughout the research process and learned how powerful they can be in creating common languages across diverse knowledge systems through unlocking new understandings and inviting participation by enabling people to really see themselves reflected in the work and ultimately get excited about contributing to it and co-creating something together. I'm joining you today from the treaty and traditional territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation, lands that have historically and currently been stewarded by the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, and Attawandaron peoples. I say this land acknowledgement because, for many reasons, but ultimately, knowledge and creativity are generated and shared in context, and every new piece of knowledge or creative product is connected to what came before it. I know that I learn best when I'm present, when I'm in relationship with people and place, and when I can understand where I am and where I'm coming from. I can also better position myself to contribute, learn, and listen in meaningful ways. So, in this virtual space that we're creating together, please take a moment to reflect on where you are and whose lands you're on, and recognize what you're bringing to this space as well, whether that's questions, intentions, knowledge, experience, enthusiasm, what have you. And also, how do the peoples and places around you influence those things and those ways of knowing? Speaking of knowledge that comes before, this webinar is based on elements and content from the Infographics in Practice program from last year in 2024, developed through a collaboration between the Ontario Agri-Food Innovation Alliance, the Community Engaged Scholarship Institute, the Research Innovation Office, Food from Thought, and the Arrell Food Institute. Lots of folks, lots of great folks collaborating on this. Our goal for the next hour or so is three parts. It's all related, basically to understand what infographics are and why they matter, and explore how to make visual stories resonate with different audiences through infographics by learning the basic principles of effective infographic design and using those design principles and layouts and techniques with intention. So first, what are infographics? Um, they're essentially ways of processing data into information, into knowledge. To create infographics and share that knowledge relies on your ability to process and add meaning to data and information. Graphic designers are amazingly talented people, but for us in the field of knowledge mobilization, that skill of adding meaning to data is what distinguishes between graphic design and designing for knowledge mobilization. The way you process that data will depend on your audience, their needs, and your communication goals. So just a brief overview, data are words, images, numbers, events, specific facts, often raw with no context, without any identifiable patterns immediately. Through processing data, we get to information. So that in the research context could be through qualitative or quantitative analysis to get to information that serves a purpose and has meaning. Information will often answer questions like who, what, where, how many, and provides a little bit more context and framing for the data that you're working with. And then through processing information, identifying themes, pulling out key ideas, that's where you get to knowledge. And that's the learning, the reasoning, the understanding that comes from engaging with the information. Knowledge is often giving you the full context, helping to build relationships, and can be applied to inform decision making. So broadly, infographics make research and knowledge more accessible, useful, and usable for a variety of audiences so that they can use that knowledge to make informed decisions and take informed actions based on solid understandings of the evidence. Because this is a webinar about infographics, here is a visual representation of what I just talked about. So think about your data as like a pile of unsorted Lego bricks. Through sorting them and arranging them by color and by size, you get some more information into what you're working with. And then through creating a Lego structure, you actually get to that knowledge. You get the data that's explained with a story. It's very clear what it is that you're looking at by looking at that finished piece. I think about infographics mainly as creative tools for mobilizing knowledge, building connections, and trust. They can help to simplify complex ideas, and that's by no means a simple process. To take a complex idea and make it understandable in a visual story while retaining the heart of that original idea is not an easy feat. And that's why this work is so important. Infographics can also open up new ways of thinking and pathways to understanding. So in doing this, they recognize there are multiple learning styles out there, not just linear ones. So particularly for nonlinear and visual learners, um, linear models aren't always applicable or appropriate for understanding the cyclical, dynamic, social, and environmental processes that we're immersed in. So being able to use visuals to tell those kinds of stories can be really useful in telling them more authentically and effectively. Infographics can also promote engagement and genuinely and facilitate informed feedback. I know that in my experience, sharing infographics and visuals as thinking around a concept develops and at different stages throughout a project invited more authentic participation and feedback. When people could see themselves reflected in what was being shared, they felt more confident in saying something about it and contributing back to it because they felt that they were on an even ground. They felt that, yes, this is my knowledge. I can see that it's being shared. I feel um, at a trained or on the same level, I guess, of being able to contribute back to it. Visuals can also spark ideas about things beyond a page and bust open constraints that are sometimes inherent in seeing like a written document or a more standard presentation of a research paper. Essentially, using more informed design choices and can help to create more reflective stories of what you're trying to talk about. And then in turn, that facilitates better feedback from the people that you're trying to reach and leads to a better overall project and more impactful results. I should also say that infographics matter for you, the person that's creating them. To go through that process of creating a visual story requires you to really understand the story you're telling. There's often like so many to choose from within one project, and to choose just one and really tell it means developing a depth of understanding that you might not reach otherwise. You're thinking about things differently, you're coming at it from different angles, you're piecing things together. The better you know that story, the better you're going to be at telling it and sharing it. In agri-food and food systems work, infographics help to bridge research, innovation, policy, and community priorities. They're more than just pretty faces. They are strategic tools for building trust and making complex information accessible. Specifically in food systems work, data can often be dense and technical and highly specified to that specific area of the food system, yet also essential for people outside of that area to understand. So, for example, people working to develop climate smart agriculture practices might need to be able to understand and incorporate research on soil health indicators into their policies. Also, retailers at food retailers might need to have some knowledge of local producers and production methods to inform some of their purchasing decisions. Um, I say all this to emphasize the point that food is a common thread that unites us all, and food affects everyone. Yet often, food systems people find themselves working towards shared goals, but from different angles and areas of expertise. And that's where visuals can help develop that common language between areas. They can help to bridge those gaps between food systems people from across disciplines and areas of expertise. So with this framing, I hope you can start to understand infographics as like more than a design, and not only things that those with design skills can create. They are knowledge mobilization tools, and creating them involves adding meaning to data and information and sharing that knowledge then in engaging ways. To guide your creative process, it's important to ask two related yet distinct questions. Who is your target audience? And what is your key message? Your key message and your target audience are inherently connected, and like your message will hinge on your audience and vice versa. I understand that many of you who are participating in the infographics and practice program through Ag Act have already gone through a stakeholder mapping exercise, so that's awesome. And now that you have those groups mapped out, you can start to think about what they need to know and how they prefer to receive that information. And for those who aren't part of that program, this information will still be super relevant to you. Your target audience is the group that can benefit from and act on the knowledge that you're sharing through your infographic. They should care about its importance, and it's your job to convey that. To really get to know your audience on a deep level, keep the following considerations in mind. First, be specific as possible. By trying to design for everyone, you end up connecting with no one. So it's really important to focus in on who you're trying to connect with. Also ask, what does your audience already know? You want to avoid redundancies or making them feel like, oh, I've seen this before, I'm just going to pass over it. Relatedly, what do they need to know? What would be new to them that builds on the knowledge that they already have? Next, what would resonate with them and their goals and values? What are they hoping to do with the knowledge that you're sharing? Relatedly, what language and tone will be most effective for connecting with them? And why will they benefit from this knowledge? Asking that question why again and again will help you as well to keep your focus clear and come through on the other side. Finally, what are some potential barriers to your audience for accessing that information or that knowledge that you're sharing? Accessibility here, I want to emphasize, is not optional. It's really foundational to your design. So text, color, font choices, contrast, they all contribute to how your audience accesses information. I'll go into detail on each of those design components later, but for now, just know that accessibility facilitates connection, and that's why it's important to understand design considerations and make informed decisions about them. I'm not going to go into depth on accessibility practices. There's so much information out there that is way beyond what my expertise touches. So I will link to some helpful resources following this, but just know that this is something that runs through a lot of design decisions. Next, as you're connecting with your audience or getting to know them and starting to craft a clear message, to make sure it's clear to yourself and to your audience, you can start by asking some questions like, why did you pursue this topic in the first place? Why is it important? And what was the initial state or environment prior to doing this work? Um, what was the problem you were looking to solve? How did you solve that problem? What is different now after doing this work? And what did you learn? Asking these questions at different points again and again, they'll all help you get like clearer on where you're coming from and what you want to do and what you want to communicate. In an infographic, what makes a clear message? Like, how can we identify a clear message on an infographic? Um, it's right up front. It's like the title, it's one of the main headings, it's a key visual feature. It's very easy for your audience to identify what it is that infographic is about. A clear message also focuses on typically one core idea or story. Less is more. Resisting that urge to have too many key messages is important. That can start to make things a little muddy or lose the thread, I guess. And again, it creates that break in engagement, and you're not really capturing any attention beyond that. Also, a clear message emphasizes why an audience should care about what you're trying to share. By answering some of the questions on the last slide and taking into consideration the things before, your message should inherently incite care because you're inherently considering your audience's needs and priorities. Next, a clear message prioritizes action or insight over novelty. So you're not just dumping facts on people. Uh, Calls to action can include things like, here's why you need to know this, or steps to blank, or your questions about this thing answered. Fun facts are great and interesting, but in an infographic, unlikely to motivate people to want to do or change anything about what they're doing. Next, avoid focusing on like everything you know about this is wrong or other shame adjacent phrasing. You don't want to shame people or make them feel like they don't know something. Um, that can get distasteful and prey on vulnerabilities. And what you want to do with a clear message is uphold the dignity and knowledge of the people that you're trying to communicate with to have a conversation about it. Finally, this should go without saying, but avoid jargon or academic framing in your messaging. Jargon is relative and will be specific to different audiences. So that's all part of getting to know your audience earlier too, is understanding what sorts of things are common language or phrasing in that context and trying to stick with that, and anything that's outside of that, either avoiding or defining more clearly. So after getting to know your audience and crafting your clear message, how can you make sure that that message like connects with your audience? Here are some tips that I've found to be useful for doing this. There's lots of other ways and pathways of creating connection, but I wanted to highlight these 6 here as they're good starting points, I think. So first, using real world context. You want to frame your message around the real world relevance for people that it affects. So, for example, farmers who are interested in um, nitrogen efficiency or fertilizer, rather than having a title or a heading that highlights, nitrogen efficiency and lentil wheat rotations, reframing that as how lentils can help grow wheat better with less fertilizer. It's more clear to the point and gets to the relevant piece of information for farmers right away. It'll help them grow their wheat better. This is an example infographic that places real world benefits right up front. So under the title, it has like the increased profit per acre, soil benefits, community benefits. That's really important for people whose livelihoods would depend on this kind of information. So just making it very clear to the point, um, and also including like imagery and photos that are relevant to help to place it into that real world context. Next, agri-food research often has some of the most tangible outcomes you can think of when it comes to research, directly affecting people and environments. As I said earlier, food connects us all. Um, you can emphasize those impacts visually when designing your infographics and use visuals to show how things change over time, show before and after scenarios, like this example here. So using color to really highlight what changes in between one situation and another, or show geographic relevance. So if you're showing like carbon sequestration, you could use map-based visuals to show the concentration or carbon sequestration in different Canadian grasslands. So really using visuals to your advantage here. It helps to also reduce the amount of text that you might use as well. Next, finding and creating the right tone. So like a style or a mood, tone is more than just your written content. It includes images, drawings, font, color choice, shapes, symbols, layout, like all of those things. They all contribute to building a certain tone. Knowing your audience, being clear on your message, and using the right medium helps to build the right tone. So getting to know your audience means also like who are they? What are they used to? What kinds of like environments are they used to receiving information in? Um, this is an example from the Infographics in Practice program last year. The student created an infographic specifically for backyard farmer or gardeners. So the tone here was more playful. There was more illustrative components, lighter on the text, and an easier thing to like just pass out as a handout. So the tone here was meant to be very targeted towards that audience and not necessarily like a research poster. Oh, we're going backwards now. Next, using familiar visuals. So icons and imagery that resonate with agri-food audiences are things like plants, soil, animals, food, weather. Make sure you're using the right animals for the right types of research to avoid embarrassment, those types of things. Um, Avoid using overly abstract or data-heavy visuals unless your audience is like highly technical. Um, This is an example not from agri-food, but from a project I did with designing a visual for the IPCC, one of their chapters in their climate change reports. So this was climate change impacts on mental health in the circumpolar north. In this context, mental health was a relatively newer or unfamiliar concept to folks who are typically engaging with IPCC reports, so more natural science focus. But this visual diagram, the hazard, vulnerability, exposure, risk diagram, was a familiar visual. So by taking newer information, putting it in a familiar visual context, we were better able to find a pathway into getting that information out there. Another example of using familiar visuals, this is a graphic from a book chapter that was part of my dissertation. We used imagery that was reminiscent of the wildlife and lands around Nunatsiavut, the settlement region in Labrador. And some feedback we got from some of the first iterations of this was the bear initially had like a very large like hump on its back, more like a grizzly. And our community partners were like, we don't have those here. We have polar bears and they look very different. So that was like a good um, thing to keep in mind going forward because a bear in one context is not necessarily the same as a bear in another. So keeping those kinds of things in mind to connect with your audience shows like additional levels of care and attention to detail that may not be apparent right away, but to the people who are receiving this information or engaging with it, they'll feel more seen and understood. Next, to connect your infographics best with your audiences, you want to align with their values. So in food systems work, that's often things like sustainability, livelihoods, food security. Those are kind of like the ultimate goals, I think, of a lot of the work that we're doing. And you want to make those valuables visible in your design. So this is another example from outside of the food systems context, but it was a directory of services that I created in partnership with the Chippewas of Nawash First Nation. They didn't want like a booklet of all the services. They wanted it organized by generation and community group. It was easier to then point people in the right direction to the services that they wanted to access. It was a very quick reference point, and visually, the tree held a lot of significance and meaning. So we worked with the tree metaphor to design this directory. Next, prioritizing accessibility. So I touched a little bit on more aesthetic and accessibility considerations there. So things like font, text size, color, contrast, all those things. Um, Accessible infographics improve comprehension, enhance engagement, and ultimately build trust and respect and show that additional level of care and attention to detail. This is an example I like to share of like accessibility beyond just like AODA requirements. This was developed by the team at Pixels and Plans, which they do really cool work. Um, a quote from their website that describes this infographic is, "Once in a while, clients pose challenges that initiate an exciting approach to existing design methodologies. In this case, all design work had to be done using only black and white, um, because the resulting infographics would be printed in areas where colored ink was not readily available. Using only two shades was not, in this case, a limitation, but rather an opportunity to experiment with minimal design." So I use this example to inspire a lot of creative problem solving when I run into constraints in my own work, where it's not necessarily a constraint, or it is a constraint, but it's not a challenge, it's an opportunity to do something a little bit differently or think outside the box. So I thought this was a good example of showing accessibility beyond just sort of the standard accessibility considerations that we think about. To recap, here are some overview of the tips that I just went through to connect with your audience in a meaningful and impactful way. Um, this will look different depending on you, your project, and your audience, but keeping these things in mind as a starting point will set you on the right track. Next, I'd like to move into design principles. So these are your visual storytelling tools. Design is not just about decoration, it's all about clear and creative communication. Things like color and typography will help set your tone. Things like your layout and the framing that will help to guide a person through a story. So all of those tools and frameworks and things together, they work well when you can use them, when you know why you're using them and can use them intentionally. And thinking about how your design choices will translate or how they'll make people feel or how they'll receive a story will help you make those decisions about what to use and how to do that with intention. So I'm going to go through just a few. I mean, there's a lot more than this beyond what I can just cover today, but these are some of the core ones that are, I feel, relevant to infographic design. I am going to use one of my old posters from my research. This was like 10 years ago now. So there's definitely things I would do differently, but um, I thought picking apart some of my own work would be easier than trying to pick apart someone else's. I should also say that my intent is not for you to read the words that are on the screen. This was a large format poster that was presented at a conference. So just looking and focusing on the visuals, the spacing, the contrast, like that's my hope through this next section. I'll start by talking about contrast. So contrast is something that creates visual excitement and highlights important elements, and it can be created with shape, color, size, or texture. So here I've used contrast in a couple different ways. Like I have a white background, I've contrasted some photos with more designed elements. I have the larger um, main findings section is much bigger in contrast to the other introduction, methods, and implications sections. Those are all contrast related decisions that help to guide someone through a story. Next, proximity. Proximity creates unity in a design and can be used to group similar concepts. So visually connecting elements through placement, color, size, text, that's all proximity considerations. So even things like I would consider having like the same typeface or same style font for the headings is a way of like, in my mind, I'm like, oh, that font means this type of heading. This means this is a new section. So it's like your brain just works in that way, or my brain does. Also, just like the introduction section grouped together, the method section grouped together. Those are all proximate to each other and related to each other. Next, space. So space between elements can be used to group or separate information. So space and proximity kind of go hand in hand here. But also think about the space that you're not using. So you can avoid cluttering by using negative space effectively. Here, I've used a lot of negative space, especially in relation to more typical research posters. I remember getting a bit of pushback on this because it wasn't a standard way of presenting a research project. But this poster did indeed end up going to win the poster competition. So sometimes it's good to push back a little bit and stay true to the story that you're trying to tell. Alignment. So aligning different elements can create visual connections between them. Proper alignment also helps to keep your designs clear and concise. Alignment tools and strategies are often built into the softwares that you might be using to design. So use those grids, use those guides as much as you can. Here, aligning things in on the side and to each other on the overarching poster um, helps to create that sort of clarity. And also, I would even say like this line connecting the different like location points in the main findings section keeps them aligned with each other in a way. It's a more non-linear way of using alignment to guide an eye through a visual story. Next, color. So choose colors that are associated with your subject matter or that are prominent within the graphics of your project. So here, this project was specific to a community in Northern Labrador. So those are often like blues and greens that are familiar. You're going to see less reds, fewer reds, oranges, and yellows in those areas. So sticking to a more like blue ice and sky focused palette was the move here. I like to use tools like Adobe Color Wheel to find and generate color palettes. This is a really useful tool. You can explore their color library by typing in keywords that you're looking for if you want a certain mood to be created, like environmental, eco-friendly, like farm focused, those types of things. You can also upload photos and extract color palettes from those photos. So if your poster has a lot of photos in it, or you want to showcase photos from your project and you want the colors to look nice with those photos, it's a good way to find those combinations. Oh, we're going back again. Typography. Typography, similar to color, should be legible and accessible. Ideally, I would advise picking two complementary fonts to use throughout your poster. More than that can get a little bit messy and start to take away from the overarching story. Um, Sans serif fonts are typically my go-to. They're the more accessible to use. They lack those decorative features on the ends of letters. For those that aren't familiar, they're just cleaner and easier to read. Serif fonts contain more decorative features on the letters. So think Times New Roman, Garamond, name another serif font. Um, Display fonts, so things like what I have here for my heading, That's my own handwriting, and that's kind of best for small amounts of text, like titles and headers and more graphic heavy designs. Not as accessible to read, but when used in small doses can add and contribute to the tone or visual language that you're trying to create. Similar to the color tool, I like to generate and find font pairings using some online software. So Monotype has a font pairing tool where you can look at different combinations of fonts together and see how they look. That's a good starting point if you're just kind of like, I don't even know. So yeah, I have linked to that here for you to explore afterwards. Finally, balance involves creating visual structure, harmony, or conversely, clear written and visual counterpoints. And that can be achieved through many means, often applying the design principles that I've already discussed. So things like contrast, proximity, and space all contribute to the balance of a design. Balance can be symmetrical, equal on all sides. So I would say this poster is pretty symmetrically balanced in terms of like the weight of the different solid objects against the background and to each other on either side. Balance can also be asymmetrical, so more skewed to one side, or radial, so arranged around a central point. Um, Different, again, strategies for finding balance will make more sense for some stories than others. On the topic of balance, in infographics, you're often using text and visuals, and it's important to find a good balance between those. To do this, I usually start by asking, like, what can visuals do that words can't? And likewise, when is text or context needed to situate or provide framing to a visual? Visuals and text should work together to communicate key concepts, and you want each to play to their own strengths. They each serve a purpose, and often you find that balance through lots of iterations and moving things around. Often you're limited by the like size of an infographic or the constraints there, and that'll help actually to inform some decisions about where to reduce text, where to reduce visuals, that sort of thing. So here, um, this is an example of a very text-heavy infographic, less of an infographic, more of just like a formatted list. Um, Not a lot of like visual components that actually help to contribute to the story that is trying to be told here. Conversely, I don't really know what I'm looking at here. This is a lot of like visual data representation, but I don't know what it is of. There's no headings or subheadings. I don't know what the main message is. So being able to add some context to this might, boost the communication potential of it. And similarly with the other one, maybe arranging it around like a common visual or takeaway might boost the way the text is trying to, reach you. This is an example of a good balance of images or visuals and text. Um, Supporting images give some context to the data. There's strategic use of text, color, size, and boldness to emphasize important information. And overall, it's a fairly well-balanced ratio of text to imagery and is pleasant to look at and can be read quite quickly. Apologies, you're just getting a review. Here we go. So with those design principles in your tool belts, we're now going to move through talking about framing. So how to create the framework within which to use your tools to tell your story. I'm going to go through 4 different layout styles today, but just know that there's many more, and this is just a starting point. Um, don't feel limited to the 4 layouts that I'm going to go through. You can use them in combination with each other. You can use other ones outside of it. Essentially, it all comes back to like what story you're trying to tell and what layout is best for that story. Don't start with the layout, start with the story first. With that caveat in mind, timeline style layouts are one of the more common ones that I see. So those usually visually represent events, milestones, or developments in a chronological order. They're typically designed as a vertical or horizontal flow using icons, dates, and brief text to mark each key point in that timeline. I would use a timeline layout when I want to simplify complex sequences of events or demonstrate a cause and effect. When I want to show progression over time, so the stages of a research project, the history of a concept, or trends in data, or also just wanting to take people on a visual journey and help to connect the dots better than through a dense paragraph of text. Timeline style layouts don't always have to be time-centric. As exemplified in this infographic, it shows the progression of infection from sow to offspring. So I would classify this as like mainly a timeline style layout, marking the different points in time that the infection moves from sow to offspring. Next, comparison style layout. These layouts often place two or more items side by side to highlight similarities, differences, or key characteristics. And that often involves using symmetrical columns, contrasting colors, or icons to enhance clarity. I would use a comparison style layout when I'm discussing opposing viewpoints, pros and cons, before and after scenarios, when I want to help audiences make choices by clearly laying out differences between those scenarios, um, or when content involves like a comparative analysis, like comparing experimental results, theoretical frameworks, to identify policy impacts and really inform real world relevance there. This is another example from the Infographics in Practice program from last year, highlighting the do's and don'ts of reducing nutrient runoff on of fertilizer on farms. And this is a good example of a comparison layout. The do's are highlighted in the green boxes, and the don'ts are highlighted in the red ones. And there's two scenarios, one on either side, one clearly showing a more positive situation than the other. Next, data-driven layouts. So these infographics focus typically on visualizing numerical data using graphs, charts, and the like. These types of layouts emphasize clarity and help audiences quickly grasp trends, relationships, or outliers. I would use these types of layouts when simplifying complex data sets for non-expert audiences or like summarizing key takeaways for them. Also, when messages rely on demonstrating trends or distributions or correlations in an impactful way, or when I want to make research tell a story by presenting findings or survey results in a clear, engaging way. And there's just a lot of data to work from, and organizing it is kind of the best way of telling that story. You'll often see data-driven style layouts for government contexts, so things like this. There's a lot of data and information here, but it's organized well. There's clear lines that delineate the different sections. They've used, bold text, highlighting things in different colors. They've used icons and imagery. They've made certain design decisions that help to make this data-heavy infographic a little easier to parse. Finally, process style layouts. So these are infographics that typically break down workflows, procedures, or sequential steps into a visual format. They're often depicted with arrows, icons, and numbered sections, helping really to guide an audience through a process. I would use these types of layouts when an audience needs a step-by-step guide on completing a task or understanding a complex procedure. When you want to communicate abstract concepts, process layouts are helpful here. Also, when you want to explain how something works, such as a methodology, a scientific experiment, or a decision-making process. Similar to timeline style in a lot of ways, but I would classify like process style layouts as a bit broader. They can be used to capture more nonlinear processes that don't follow a like start to finish kind of flow. This is an example from the Infographics in Practice program from last year again. showing the process of how climate change factors increase food contamination risks. And it's a little bit, there's lots of arrows going on, lots of things happening, but then you can see, oh, they've color coded climate change factors in white, the food contamination impacts in yellow, and then they've used arrows to kind of show how those different processes work together. Um, yeah, so before we go into some other examples, just remember that there's no one right way to design an infographic, no one right layout to use. Your design is going to be specific to your audience and your message and your story. So just, yeah, keep that in mind and don't let comparison be your enemy. I wanted to share some examples from projects at different stages. So, just showing how layout, tone, visual hierarchy, design considerations can be used to adapt to different goals. There are always stories to tell, regardless of what stage you're at, whether that's, forming an interdisciplinary team, collecting data, or at the end of a project. Um, and it's just about how you tell that story. So this is an example clearly, like the very beginning, showcasing an intention for an energy investment strategy. They've used just a standard Venn diagram that shows their right to participate on the left-hand side. So utilizing strategic assets, having an iconic brand base, using supply chain expertise, and on the right-hand side, outlining future energy trends. And then where those circles intersect is where they want to participate in energy investment. So this kind of approach could be used for when you're describing like what you're going to be researching or where you're starting from, what you already know, what the goals for, sustainable livelihoods are, and then in the middle is maybe where your research project focuses and what you are going to do based on those two elements combining. Just one idea of, before you have results to share, you can still share a story about your project. This is an example from like clearly a later stage project. So showing where what healthy soil starts with, and then as a result of having healthy soil, what that will do for you on your farm. And I liked this one because it's very clear. The message at the very top is about boosting your bottom line with healthy soil. So a farmer or producer who sees this would know what it is that they're looking at right away and why it might be important for them. Another example at the later stage of a project, just showing how genetic engineering can be used as a tool to fight climate change, showcasing, again, noting that there's not like intense like research data on this. It's really just telling the story about like we focused on decreasing atmospheric carbon dioxide and how synthetic and systems biology can be used to within that context and then potential. So it's a story of the research without getting too technical or data heavy right away. So this is clearly for an audience that's like maybe outside of the field of synthetic and systems biology. I know for me, I am outside of that field, and I could relatively easily understand what it was that I was looking at. So again, just another example of an angle you could take in telling a story. So we've taken infographics apart as a concept, and now we're going to pull them back together. How to create an infographic in just 8 easy steps. No promises. This is just my typical process. It is not the process, and it is not a process I use every single time, but it is one that I will refer back to and typically follow with some tweaks here and there. Um, Before even starting to create a design, I work to gather background material and context. I meet with my collaborators, I meet with those who I'm going to be, if I can, sharing this infographic with, ask questions and identify goals. Um, and then I work with them to develop the story. And then I go back and I say, does this story make sense based on what we talked about? And they'll either say yes or no, or add some detail here and there. And then I'll go back and I'll sketch out the concept using a pen and paper and just kind of outline what we talked about. And then I'll go back and ask, okay, does this make sense? Like, is this along the lines of what we're talking about together? And then they'll give me feedback and I'll incorporate it. I'll start to add imagery and design elements. So I will note that it's not until step 6 here that I'm actually using design software. All the steps before that are about collaboration, identifying a message, connecting with my audience, and really getting a handle on what it is that we're communicating. And then I add in, you know, the fun details. And I'll incorporate feedback after sharing that with them, going back on and reflecting on initial goals, and making sure that whatever the final product is reflects that initial or those conversations that we've had throughout that process. So it's really involved. Um, and it depends on, your connections with your audience and collaborators and all those types of things. If you don't have a direct connection with them, there are still ways of understanding and kind of beta testing, I guess, your designs through like just like sharing it with people who are just outside of that field. If it makes sense to them, it probably you're probably good or on the right track. Um, Keeping in mind like the things that you really want your audience to remember, and getting feedback early and often is really important. And that's kind of what I wanted to drive home with this slide, was showing that like there's lots of cyclical processes involved in getting and receiving and incorporating feedback to create a really solid design. Oh, there's another arrow for you. This is a visual representation of that process. So I've had the pleasure of working with several student groups over the years, through one of the courses that we support through the Arrell Food Institute, where the student groups would work on community partnership projects. So they'd be partnered with a community group or organization and would be tasked with developing like a research project that answered a question or a need or a priority of that group. So what I would do is I would come in near the end of those projects and talk with the students about what they did, why they did it, going through the questions that I laid out earlier about like, what did you do? What is different now? What was the initial like state of the environment before going into this work? And it would be a very informal discussion, just stream of consciousness. What is this project? Why was it important? What did you learn from it? And as we would talk, I would take notes, I would sketch, I would doodle, and then I'd go back and kind of make a more cohesive sketch, something like this, that I would then share back to each of those groups and ask for feedback. And here, important to emphasize, like there's no color, there's no nice like fonts, or anything like that. I would also accompany this with like a written description of what I did in the sketch, just for accessibility purposes and to get better feedback. Um, and then we'd go back and forth. We'd talk about, the story that was being told within this sketch and did it make sense? And eventually it would wind up as something like this. So it's not as easy as like a click of a button like that, but it just is meant to show that to get to an endpoint, there's a lot of processes involved and a lot of people involved and a lot of questions and yeah, just humbling yourself and making sure that you're really listening and reflecting what you're hearing. Creating infographics can feel intimidating, especially when you're trying to distill complex research into a single visual. So I wanted to talk through some common challenges that I've experienced and that I've heard lots of others experience as well, and how to work through them. So first, lack of creativity or visual confidence. Many people say, I'm not a designer, I'm not an artist. That's okay. Infographics are not about artistry. They're about clarity. Artistry is a bonus. You can have a really pretty infographic, but if it's not clear or if it doesn't tell a clear story, it kind of like it doesn't really serve anything. Like it's just nice. And that's not the goal here. The goal is to tell a really clear, cohesive visual story. So to kind of get around or work through this challenge, some recommendations would be to start with structure. So use templates, grids, sketching to build your confidence. Look at examples for inspiration and not comparison. Again, your story is your story. Somebody else is over here making really nice infographics. They're telling different stories than you, and so likewise, like their infographics will look very different. Once you have a good idea of what it is you're trying to tell, then I would say using tools with built-in templates is helpful. So through your sketching, through your conversations with the people that you're working with, once you kind of decided, I think like a process layout or like a timeline style layout will probably be my best bet here. You can go into platforms like Canva or Adobe Express that often have built-in templates to reduce design pressures. You can go in and like type in timeline style layout and it'll give you some examples. Again, I would recommend not doing that first because that can, for me at least, distract me from what my message is. So getting clear on your message first and then going into finding a template to work from is typically it helps me in the long run, I think, rather than having to go back and totally redo it. Next, balancing scientific or research integrity with accessibility. You want to be accurate, but not overwhelming with the information and knowledge you're sharing. Remember that infographics are not research papers. They serve a very different purpose. They often complement an article or a report or something like that, and they're a conversation starter. They're not trying to tell the entire conversation. Focusing on your key message and supplementing as needed is a good workaround here. So you'll often see, or more frequently, QR codes or links on infographics linking to more information. That's a good way of continuing a conversation beyond what's on the poster. Um, and not having to like jam it all in, even reference lists and things like that, depending on the requirements of, the conference or the venue that you're sharing. You might not need to include like a whole reference list or citations on your infographic. You can just link to them afterwards, and that helps to reduce some of the clutter or design pressure there. Next, clear language is not about dumbing things down. So by being clear on the language that you're using, you're not necessarily taking away from the heart of it, the intent or anything. You're just being clear. So you're making it accessible. So thinking about clear language is a bridge and not as like a taking away type of thing is just a good mindset to get into. Next, time constraints and tool limitations. Design takes a lot of time, as does writing a research article, doing a research project, like all those things. But it doesn't have to be a time sink. And once you start to practice it more and do it in a way that feels authentic and good to you, it ends up, it'll take less time than you actually think. As you do this more often, reusing elements when you can is really helpful. So building a visual library, like I know I have a lot of like color palettes that I draw on for similar projects. I have a lot of icons that I'll use again and again. Um, Photos, depending again on rights and copyrights, those are all things that are helpful for giving you a starting point, so you're not starting from scratch every time. I also like to block off like design sprints. So similar to if any of you have ex tried or practiced the Pomodoro method with writing. So that's where you write for like a 20-minute block, take a 5-minute break. You can do the same thing when designing, giving yourself like a time constraint, even when you feel constrained, can actually help to focus you and give that time and attention that you need to just get started and get something on the page. Also, just emphasizing again, sketching first and then digitizing is a good move because it takes away the pressure of like having something like look good right away. Next, choosing the right format. This has been a lot of information. There's a lot of choices and decisions to make within this context. Um, but don't feel like you need to stick to all the things that we talked about today. If you can just take away like, you know, having some thought and intention behind why you're choosing what you're choosing, if that's what you take away from today, that's great. Choose the format that matches your message. Refer to existing examples too, especially if you're communicating or sharing with an audience that there are great examples of. Refer to those, see what the, tone and layouts are that have worked well, and learn from that and build on it and iterate from there. These are just like some quick tools, and there's so many out there. These are the ones I usually recommend, regardless of, experience level. Canva is a really good one for like dragging and dropping. You can have your own like visual library in there to use elements that you pull from again and again. Great for beginners, great for advanced. I really do usually recommend Canva, or PowerPoint. I've seen some really excellent infographics and have designed infographics using PowerPoint. Um, it's a very familiar tool for most of us, especially in like the research space, and it has surprising flexibility. Similarly, Google Slides, any sort of like slide deck, you can just change the size of your slide that you're working with to suit the format and go from there. Also, Adobe Express, slightly more advanced, but still fairly intuitive. You basically you want to choose the right tool based on what you're comfortable with, what your skill level is, what your goals are. Um, you don't need to be a designer to make those great infographics. You start with what you're comfy with, and figure out, how where to go from there. Some supporting tools for when you're designing, again, the Adobe Color Wheel generator, generating color palettes that match your topic's tone is really helpful. The monotype font pairing tool, finding fonts that work well together. I'm not gonna like go into too much depth on AI because it's a wild beast. I wouldn't recommend designing an infographic using AI. I have not done it, but I would assume that you'd get some pretty comical results. Um, I think it could be helpful for brainstorming layout ideas or refining your message. Again, like once you already have an idea of what the message is and story you're trying to tell, maybe then entering some like prompts into like, does this make sense? What are some other examples out there? Using it as like a tool to help um, guide your process rather than like a relying on that tool to do your process for you. That would be my advice. But again, not an expert in this by any means. And that would just be my, little yellow flag to put up there. Takeaways from this, again, lots of information thrown your way. Um, if you take anything away, infographics are about clarity, creativity, connection, and trust. They're more than just visuals, they're invitations to connect. They help us share knowledge in ways that are meaningful, accessible, and reflective of the communities and contexts that we're working in. Um, Make informed decisions about design principles and layouts that will help you connect with your audience, be clear on your message, um, and stay rooted in all of those things. Sketch it out, get feedback, and let that process of designing be relational, not just technical. You also don't need to be a designer to communicate visually or to make something impactful. You just need to care about the story you're telling and the people you're telling it to. And if you ever feel stuck, reaching out for mentorship, collaboration, all of those things, curiosity is part of the process. And I know that I'm always eager and excited to work with curious folks, as I'm very curious myself and constantly learning. So with that, here are a few more, lots more resources that'll be shared on the slides afterwards, with some links to the different places to go and explore. Lots more resources here. And with that, thank you for listening. Again, it's a real delight to be here as a lifelong learner in the visual space. And I am looking forward to having conversations with many of you, answering questions, and following those curious thoughts. So, yes, thank you, everyone.